How should I start learning game dev? Depends on what you're trying to learn. I was 9 years old when I started with Game Maker. But before that, I was actually working in the Warcraft 2 level editor and the StarCraft 1 level editor. If you're trying to be a generalist, here's what's worked for me in my life. So how should you start learning game dev? Level editors. Simple level editors. This could be Mario Maker. Here's the thing, is that you want to learn the fundamentals of how games work, what makes them fun. And there's a few very basic lessons just to start you off. I learned this when I was 9. Lesson number 1 is computers are stupid. A lot of people have this lie that computers are really smart, and they're not. Computers are the stupidest things on the planet. Computers know 0 and 1. And computers are so stupid that if you tell them, hey, I want this character to move in this direction, you never tell them to stop the character moving, the character will never stop moving, and they will fly through walls, they will fly off the screen, and they will never stop. Don't expect the computer to magically do stuff for you. Heck, even if you're using a pre-built engine, you generally can't expect the computer to do everything that you want for you. I mean, I can tell you that at work, we're running all sorts of fun with Unity physics right now. Your player is not the enemy. I remember me and my brother making StarCraft levels for our dad, and we were probably like 6 or something. We don't unfortunately have all the levels anymore. We have some of them, so we can still hear our prepubescent voices voicing Jim Raynor in the Zerg. But anyway, one of the earliest game dev lessons that I ended up learning, we just made terrible levels for our dad. Literally, we had, if you're familiar with StarCraft at all, we had like a Dark Archon, and then we had all these enemies everywhere. And his goal was to destroy the command center up here. He hated this level. I think this was the straw that broke the camel's back, but he ended up using the Dark Archon, and maybe he beat it. And then he was like, okay, new rule. You are not allowed to ask me to play a level unless you beat it yourselves first. That was a critical lesson, was we are not allowed to ask other people to beat our game unless we can beat it first. So your player is not the enemy. Make games that you can beat. Playtester games. I remember in college, we had these like similar games that we were all making. We had this like project, and several of my classmates just made their levels so hard that they were impossible to beat. Like literally, like one of my friends in class actually ended up spending like a half hour beating this stupid box puzzle mini game, and it wasn't fun, but my classmate thought it was hilarious, so they did it anyway. Anyway, playtester games, it's always easy for you. Make it feel easy for you, because it's not going to feel easy for your players, because you're all used to the feel, you're used to the controls, you're used to all of it. Your player is not. Actually, there was a book in college which helped solidify this for me. It was, I feel like, the only good thing I got out of the book. It was called Game Maker's Apprentice. I had used Game Maker for years beforehand, so I was like, I already know all of this. Game Maker's Apprentice, the thing that they got into in there, which I thought was great, was it's like, hey, guess what? The Game Maker's Apprentice, you're not the apprentice. Your player is the apprentice. Your player is the one you're supposed to teach. You're supposed to be growing your character. And actually, I think of this in terms of just general story theory. So in story theory, at least the story theory that I like to teach, I have a character. This character needs to be able to face this big bad. So the thing is that right now, they are weak as heck. They are not strong enough to handle this. And this is like the player. You know, if you started the game and you threw your player into the final boss immediately, odds are they wouldn't be able to beat them. Generally, your goal is to get your character, your player, ready to face the final battle. And so one of the things that I think of in a way that I like to think about game design is my goal is to grow the player to handle the trials ahead. Actually, I think that Breath of the Wild is a great example of this, where you are growing to face the final challenge. Now, on the game it might be your player falls into pits all the time. Oh my goodness, it's a pit. I'm a stick figure. I can fall in this. But then you got this giant pit over here by the big bad, and it's like, okay, you need to get better at jumping, son. How do I grow my player into who they need to be in order to reach the climax? Your player is not the enemy. You're trying to help your player. If you start viewing your player as the enemy, you're not going to make fun games. Now, I will say that there are some games that thrive on this. I want to be the guy who's all about messing with the player. But in general, that's not what you're trying to do. Certainly, you need to keep in mind your goals with the game, but in general, you're not trying to do that. If you're just trying to get started, trying to figure out what the heck is going on, start with level editors. Maybe you're like, I've already done level editors. Well, think about game design as you're using the level editors. Don't just make a level, but then be like, well, why would I do this? Why? What's the benefit of this? Start in 2D. That's something that I really strongly recommend. You remove one plane. It makes it way easier. Start in 2D. Don't just learn how to do things, learn why you're doing them. Because if you just learn how to do it, if you're like, oh, here's how I move a game object, and then you're like, oh, I need to make a menu, it might seem like there's no lessons to be drawn between the two. But if you're like, oh, well, here's a core concept in Unity, is that there's these objects and they have properties, and those properties can be floats or ints or bools or strings, and they could be this and that and lists and da. If you learn the core concepts, it's not as hard to transfer your knowledge to other areas. If you are determined not to learn why, you're going to fail. If you're the guy who just goes to Stack Overflow and copies stuff and never learns why, you're not going to grow that much. If you want to work on more advanced systems or you want to build something new, then I would say learn the core concepts of programming. Heck, even if you're Googling a lot of stuff, you know what to Google for, at least. Don't do a platformer. Do a top-down game. There are certain things that it's like you spend a long time on and that just take a long time to polish. And then there are other things where it's like, okay, you're going to be doing a lot of these. If you're starting off in programming, you're not going to be doing the core systems first, most likely. You're going to be doing the extra systems, the other ones. Learn how to do the stuff you do a lot, not just the stuff that's hard. So an example of that could be an inventory system. An example of that could be interactions with different characters. It could be triggers. Learn some of the stuff that might seem boring or less core to your game. I'm not saying don't learn the other stuff. If you're joining a small team, if you're joining an indie team, you could do everything. So it's good to know how to do everything. But if you're going for AAA or for a larger company, like let's say that there's already 5 programmers on the team, you're probably going to be starting with simpler stuff, probably. And so not saying don't learn the other stuff, just start with like, how do I build an inventory system? You need to start simple and learn the concepts. Just moving a character around in 2 dimensions, like that takes some time to figure out. It takes time to figure out how to make that feel good. And you're going to start and it's probably going to feel crappy. And there's going to be things that you're going to be like, oh, my character moves faster diagonally than they do moving up and down and left and right. Oh, that was a fun early lesson that I had too. So learn the core concepts of programming. Like, oh, what does X++ mean? It means that you move X1 over. Well, what are X and Y? X and Y are your position, and so you're able to move. What game programming is, you have a data representation, then you have a visual representation. On the back end, essentially, it's all these numbers that are just changing, and if you looked at them, they wouldn't mean that much. I mean, they do if you know what they're doing. Moving a character directly by adjusting X and Y is a really good starting concept. Learn about arrays, lists, depending on what you're working in. Learn about for loops, while loops. Learn about step events, frames. On update. This has different names, but just the basic game loop. If you're just like, hey, I just want to get started, I feel like that's actually quite a bit to get you started with. Draw a rect. There we go, there's a rectangle. I think that one of the things that I'd say with programming as well, specifically, is don't feel ashamed or stupid or anything if you're confused. It's confusing. You're learning a new language. I've been learning Japanese recently, and the most helpful thing for me has been realizing that it's okay to feel frustrated, because guess what? It's something that I've never seen before. It's like, hey, here's an icon. I'm supposed to know what it means. Millions of people know what it means. I don't. What's wrong with me? Well, what's wrong with me is that I never learned it. I learned a different alphabet. Maybe you're learning JavaScript, you're learning C# or C++, you're learning a different language. And I will say that once you learn the fundamentals of programming, those fundamentals transfer. You don't have to worry about, oh my goodness, I spent all this time learning JavaScript. There's no way I can be a professional game dev now. No, you can be a professional. Like, the thing is that everybody starts somewhere. If I was starting off again, I wouldn't want to start with modern day Game Maker. Micro Studio looks amazing. This actually looks like a fantastic way to start learning. So I heavily recommend it because you'll learn a lot of stuff here. I've talked with some people where they're like afraid to touch code because they're like, I'm going to destroy my computer. No, you won't. Especially in this environment, you got a website. This is not going to crash your computer. You're fine. So don't worry about it. You'll be okay. X plus equals 1. Okay. Okay, this is beautiful. And the reason I say it's beautiful is because it's teaching you the basics. You see how it's just drawing rectangles all over the place? That's the sort of thing that starting off, people don't think about. Like, if you're a new programmer, you're not gonna, that's not something that you're gonna be aware of. Like, wait a second. Why is this happening? What's wrong? Well, it's not removing any of the stuff that it's already drawn, so it's just drawing forever. This makes perfect sense. And I think that that's why you need to just start with really bare basics, because you start to see, oh wow, there's a lot of things I never thought of. This is really cool. Thanks so much for the link again, Jacob. So microstudio.dev, if you're trying to learn to become a game programmer, I would very strongly recommend this. For somebody starting to learn, this is the type of thing that I want. Just a lot of different things that you don't think about until you actually start getting into game programming. That covers that pretty well.